Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Adam, Director of Product Strategy and Go-to-Market at Oasis Security, and I'm thankful to be able to spend the next session with you. Today's talk is all about something we've been seeing everywhere in modern infrastructure, but in my opinion, still don't talk about nearly enough, and that is non-human identities, or NHIs. These are machine users in your environment, and they're exploding in volume. And as these machines increasingly behave like users, with their own credentials and access, a fundamental question that we'll try to answer today becomes, are you actually in control of them? So let's dig in. Before we get going, I want to just set the stage. And if you've been following cloud security trends, you've likely already seen this stat. But identity is now the number 1 attack vector. What we don't talk about enough is which identities are actually being targeted. So, we often assume it's about human users, compromised logins, phishing, social engineering, and that is, of course, still very, very prevalent. But attackers are evolving, and they're increasingly going after the weakest link. These are identities with the least governance and the most access. Why is this happening? For one, non-human accounts are exploding in number. In many enterprise organizations that we work with, machines or service identities, they now far outnumber human users, with most studies quoting anywhere between 5 to 50x the amount of humans. With such growth, it's no surprise attackers are targeting them. And all this culminates in the stat that we're seeing here on the screen from a recent ESG report, finding that 46% of organizations experienced a breach involving non-human identities just in the past 12 months. That's nearly half of companies surveyed. So again, in other words, machine identities, NHIs, this isn't just a hypothetical risk. These are already a common source of security incidents. This also means that chances are some of us here in this very session have experienced or maybe narrowly avoided such a breach. These often stem from things like unrotated secrets or leaked API keys or a service account with excessive privileges. The takeaway here is simple, right? It's about non-human identities representing a significant new attack surface, one that we need to manage and secure as diligently as we do for human identities, if not even more so. Today, I'll show why that's challenging with current tools and how we can regain controls. But before we jump into the details, let me quickly outline what we're going to cover. First, we'll set the stage by exploring what NHIs even are, why they're proliferating, and I'll share some examples of their growth. Then I'll challenge you gently to think about whether you're truly in control of them and how traditional identity and access management approaches, which work very well for human users, are struggling to handle machine identities. I'll introduce 5 key questions to ask about every non-human identity in your environment, which will hopefully be a practical, proactive approach to gain control over NHIs. And finally, I'll give you a simple framework you can apply today to gain visibility, reduce risk, and mature your approach to NHI governance. These will hopefully be quick wins you can take back to your team. Hopefully we can make this educational, actionable, and very real. And as we keep going, feel free to drop any questions in the chat and we'll try to address them. Of course, we'll have some time after the presentation. All right, let's dive in. So I always like to start by defining what we're even talking about when we say non-human identities. As you can see here, NHIs, they don't come in just one shape or form. They encompass accounts and users and credentials across a variety of tools. For example, an API key issued by an API gateway is an identity of sorts, right? It grants a machine access to a service. And a service account in Active Directory running a scheduled task is, of course, another very well-known NHI. Every time your system needs to talk to another system, there's probably an NHI, one or more, behind the scenes making that happen. Think about your own environment for a second here. You might have service accounts for backups, maybe scripts with hard-coded passwords, maybe CI/CD pipelines with access tokens built in, maybe cloud VMs with credentials meant to call APIs. All of these are driven and powered by NHIs. They're created by different teams, right? Sometimes it's DevOps, sometimes directly the developers, sometimes it's IT admins, and they're using different systems across all of them, which makes it no surprise they're so hard to keep track of. Key point being, NHIs are everywhere. They originate in many corners of IT, often without centralized process. And the sprawling origin, right? That's our first challenge. If we don't even know all the places identities can be created, how can we even try to secure them? Cool. So as we agreed, in many organizations, NHIs are going to be created ad hoc without a clear structure, accountability, or not even in necessarily the same team creating them. There's no central inventory. There's no consistent expiration policies. There's no clear ownership model. There's no alerting when something behaves strangely. And so as NHIs proliferate, we often end up with a situation best described as an ungoverned jungle. Unlike human identities, where HR onboarding and IAM systems give us a pretty neat garden, so to speak, with all the plants nicely labeled, machine identities are just growing out there wild. So again, if we go with this and think of your environment as a dense jungle of all these scripts and accounts and keys and tokens, they're all somehow intertwined, right? New accounts will sprout up whenever someone needs them. Secrets can be created and stored in a variety of different places. And over time, without governance, this leads to overgrowth. These could be redundant accounts, forgotten credentials, all of these posing basically what are unknown backdoors. And when we try to zoom out, it becomes really hard to see the forest from the trees. What is making this jungle ungoverned, so to speak? Simply put, it's the lack of oversight and standards, where a team create machine identities ad hoc to solve some immediate need without a policy that's centrally enforced to govern them. There isn't a clear inventory of all these accounts in use. No one's pruning old accounts that we don't need anymore, right? Access is granted, but very, very infrequently revoked. And, hopefully some of this is sounding familiar and some of you have experienced it. Maybe a periodic audit has revealed some mystery account that no one on the team remembers. Maybe it's an API key that's been sitting in some config file for years. It can get a bit chaotic. And all this is just to remind us that sprawl equals risk, right? And just like that overgrown jungle hiding dangers, an overgrown identity landscape hides security threats. So we really need to bring order to this chaos by introducing governance, introducing lifecycle to NHIs. How do we do this? We should start by borrowing lessons from how we manage human identities, which brings us to the next topic. So let's compare our situation to the human side for a moment. For years, we've known what good looks like here, right? We know that when a new employee joins, there's a well-defined process. HR maybe triggers an account creation, and an IAM system provisions access. Often this happens automatically, right? It's quick, it's consistent. It's pretty clear who owns those accounts that are created, and that's the employee itself, right? There's a manager, there's an HR record tied to it. If something's wrong with that individual account, we know who he is, we know who manages him. From there, we can, of course, enforce things like password rotation policies, things like MFA, and if needed, we can swiftly take action with minimal impact to the business as a whole. There's a strong foundation here of controls and a source of truth like Active Directory or that HR database tracking the user. For entitlements, we strive to use preset conditions based on roles, and we periodically review access to ensure it is as it is, and no one has more access than they should have. And finally, when a user leaves the company, HR and IAM processes terminate or disable their accounts. Ideally, this happens on their last day, and most mature orgs will already do this automatically. Now let's go back to NHIs and revisit the same life cycle. When a new machine identity is needed, let's say a developer that needs an API token, It's often just created manually, ad hoc, one-off, as we said, right? By whoever needs it. There's no HR system that this flows from. At best, some orgs will have a CMDB that is usually maybe a couple years out of date. Ownership. This is another good one, right? It gets murky. Who owns that service account that was created 3 years ago for some project that no longer exists? Maybe that creator left. Maybe no one remembers. And so there's often no clearly assigned owner or accountable person for an NHI. This means issues fall through the cracks. Controls like MFA, they're not really a viable option for non-human identities, right? You can't really type a code you received from a text message. And secret rotation is similarly hit or miss here. You might rotate some API keys, but many tokens and credentials will just go unchanged for years. And even if you know you should be rotating, many organizations will just choose to sacrifice that and avoid potentially breaking something. We'll get back to this in a minute. When we think of permissions, right, just to close this out here, they're usually generously granted and not usually taken away, right? How many of us has maybe encountered a service account that was given admin rights just in case, right? It works. So I don't want to touch it anymore. And to make matters worse, most of us never go back and review or certify with a clear process. We tend to just set it and forget it. If it works, it'll be there, overprivileged, lingering around, maybe even for years. And so finally, as we talk about deprovisioning, let's think about that microservice that was decommissioned last year, or that POC with the vendor that happened 3 years ago. Did someone remember to remove their accounts or their keys, or is their access still there? Often the answer is no. One thing I can count on in again almost every environment that I assess is it's going to have hundreds, if not thousands, of unused, still active accounts just sitting there, creating major gaps in the perimeter. So given what we've just discussed, if I was to try to summarize, it's clear why our traditional IAM tools and processes are struggling, right? First of all, they're built for humans. They expect a human behind the account, right? They don't account for this new complexity around unmanned accounts or accounts accessed by workloads or machines. They lack a central source of truth for these NHIs, right? There is no HR system for machine accounts. Information is going to end up living in silos in different systems. Some might be tracked in a vault. Some might be in a spreadsheet. Some might be in someone's head, right? There is no clear repository where everything goes. And importantly, there are major governance gaps here. There's no automated joiner, mover, leaver process like we're used to. There's no ownership tracking. And in fact, many of the existing IAM processes explicitly skip things like service accounts when running IAM governance campaigns. So in short, today's IAM stack, it just wasn't built with machine identities in mind. This leaves a really big gap where we're essentially trying to shoehorn NHIs into the existing tools and processes while only maybe partially addressing their needs. The result, going back to what we've spoken on, is sprawl, is orphan accounts, is unrotated credentials. Ultimately, those things are going to be what lead to 46% of organizations getting breached. Our current approach is a reactive one. We find issues during audits or after incidents, but we need to be thinking of how we can shift to a proactive stance. And how do we do that? By starting to understand the full scope of what's out there, and then by applying targeted controls. And that leads us to performing an NHI audit using a framework that we're going to introduce next. But before we go there, I just want to give another tangible example from literally weeks ago. So in late March, right, just a couple of weeks ago, Cloudflare, which is one of the most respected infrastructure companies, they experienced a global outage. And why? It all came down to a manual secret rotation process that didn't go along as they expected. They were rotating a set of tokens used by some internal services to authenticate, And during the update, some of the dependencies weren't properly tracked or updated. As a result, they had some authentication requests starting to fail, and a couple of services across their stack began to degrade and break down. So again, to make this very clear, there was no attacker, there was no malware or zero-day behind this. This was a machine identity that was updated without full visibility into where it was used. So this really exemplifies to me the cost of unmanaged NHIs. It's not just about those breaches we talked about. It's also about resilience, about availability, and about trust. So let's look inwards now. And for a minute, let's try to audit our own environment together, right? There's no judgment here, just curiosity. And so I'd like you all to ask yourself, do you know how many NHIs you have? Let's start there, right? Across AD, across cloud, across SaaS. On the human side, this is usually an easy answer. With NHIs, we often pause. Do you think all those accounts have assigned owners so that you know who to talk to if, say, they get exposed? Do you have a good understanding of how well scoped their permissions are? When's the last time you verified their permissions for some of these NHIs? Around rotation and secrets, how frequently do you rotate? How frequently would you want to rotate? Do you have a process to facilitate that? And in terms of monitoring, would you be able to know if an account were to be compromised? Do you feel like you have the guardrails, the tripwires in place to detect that? If you're not sure about any of these, that's totally okay, right? This is a new challenge, and many are just waking up to it now. The first step to improving here is recognizing that we have a problem in our hands. And by the way, that just means that we're having the right conversation right now. And the good news is that we can regain control with the right approach. All right, so let's get into it. Let's talk about how we should be reasoning about NHIs. How can we take this unstructured mess and start making sense of it? So we've developed a really simple framework, borrowed from investigators actually, that helps break down identity risk. And this is the 5 W's. Just like an investigator will ask, who was involved? What happened? When, where, and why, right? We can ask the same questions about every identity in our environment. And when we do that, we get clarity, we get accountability, and we get control. The beauty of the 5 whys is not only do they help you discover and document important information that you're going to need, they also naturally lead you to action items. And so if any of these questions are going to yield an unsatisfactory answer, those are flags, and those are tasks we should fix. So we'll go through each W in detail in the coming slides with some examples of what to look for. Let's start with the first one. So the first question we want to ask about any NHI is, who is responsible for this identity? And this goes deeper usually than just who created it, but also who's using it. And also, of course, how up to date is that info? What if the owner changed roles? What if they left the organization? How do we keep it up to date? This is crucial. It's a crucial place to start because it creates that base accountability. Essentially, ask yourself this: who should be getting the call if this identity were to misbehave? So again, imagine our security teams detect something suspicious or a password just expired and there's an outage now. Who should security or IT call first? And if you can't answer that, it probably means that we don't have the right control yet. So best practice number 1, every non-human identity should have a clear owner. Treat it like you would a human account in an org chart, right? There's always someone accountable there. This could be the application owner, could be a service owner, could be a product manager. Whoever it is, make sure it's documented and make sure it's accessible. And doing this who inventory, it brings us immediate benefits, right? If something goes wrong, we now know who to contact. If someone leaves, we now know proactively that we can assign ownership to someone else. Next up, what can this identity do? In other words, what access, what permissions, does this NHI have? For example, is it scoped to read a database? Or is it used to drop production workloads? Does it just push something to a staging repo? Or is it used to deploy something to prod? Right? Why is this important? Because machine identities, they're often massively over-permissioned. And again, this is because it's always easier to just give admin rights and move on. But if we have privilege without review, that means risk without limits. And so we should always strive to have a good grasp of all privileged accounts, not just the ones used by a human that typically find their way into PAM. There are many, many others that are usually not being tracked at all. This, again, is where we apply the known principle of least privilege to grant only what's necessary, to review it regularly, and to make that scope explicit. So that leads us to best practice number 2 here. Enforce least privilege for NHIs, not just human accounts. Catalog what each identity can do. Adjust permissions to match the current needs. And this will usually, by the way, this will require and it will mean collaboration between your IAM and security teams and those application owners. That, by the way, we just identified last step, right? And so by asking what an NHI can do, you may discover identities that have access far beyond their purpose. These will become priorities to fix. Question 3. So when, and this is all about activity. It should be pretty clear to us when an identity was created, when it was last used, and what that activity looks like over time. Some NHIs, maybe they're expected to run continuously, like one leveraged in a backend component responding to incoming requests, right? Others, maybe they should only run during deployments or as a scheduled job. Like something we hear a lot of is that annual batch job that's collecting all the data and creating some report. Importantly, this is where we're also going to ask, has this activity changed recently? And analyzing these usage patterns, highlighting expected deviations, those are going to be essential clues for us. Because the baseline activity, of course, helps us detect anomalies. And so best practice number 3, and that is continuously monitor and analyze NHI activity. Ideally, this means reviewing everything in real time, right? And getting those alerts as they happen. But honestly, even periodic reviews, they help us learn the heartbeat, so to speak, of each machine identity, so that when something is off, we can still detect it. And we can still detect it in time. This will allow us to move from reacting to a breach after it happens to proactively spotting suspicious behavior early. All right, so on to our 4th question. And this is where does this identity live and operate? This question, it's all about environmental context and scope. These are going to be critical pieces of context that are very important for us to understand how this identity operates, right? Is this NHI meant to only be used in a dev environment? Should it maybe only be contained to a single region? Is it leveraged by a specific business vertical and shouldn't really be used elsewhere? Importantly here is also to understand what systems or tools depend on the account. What's affected by it? What were to happen if it was to be modified or removed? So essentially, this is all about the boundaries and the linkages. We want each machine identity to have a defined home, a defined scope. If it strays out of it, alarms should start going off, right? So back to our best practices. This is best practice number 4. Let's maintain an up-to-date map of NHI dependencies. This might involve doing things like tagging identities with environment info. Things like, is this deployed in production or in test? Or is this used in a specific region or by a specific application in our business? And also, again, listing those dependent applications. This can happen in many ways. Sometimes it's part of a CMDB or an asset inventory. Sometimes it's tagging. Anything that allows you to effectively understand and filter in and out of that. The goal here really is to avoid surprises, right? It's to know exactly where an identity should and where it shouldn't be. And now finally, I'll ask the final question. That is why. Why does this account exist? This is one of my favorite questions, actually. This one is all about justification and ongoing necessity. Why is this so interesting to me, this question? Because as I said, every assessment I've done, we always stumble upon identities that are sitting there with no one being able to explain why, or with people even being shocked that they're still there. Sometimes these are going to be fragments from an application that no longer exists anymore. Sometimes it's just artifacts of the business evolving. And while the identities, they're left behind, they're stuck in the past, the exposure is existing in the present, right? And these identities, if I was to borrow from another area, they usually do not spark joy. And so, as Marie Kondo taught us, the solution is usually to discard or deactivate them. So the fifth best practice here, regularly prune your NHI population. Make sure that there's a strong justification for every identity. Make sure you periodically reconfirm that the account is still needed. And if it isn't, get rid of it. So we've now covered the 5 W's. By asking who, what, when, where, and why, you're effectively conducting a thorough audit and establishing governance for NHIs. This framework turns into concrete actions: assigning owners, enforcing least privilege, monitoring usage, mapping dependencies, and cleaning up or adjusting based on necessity. What we just covered, these are the foundations of NHI security best practices. They allow us to deeply understand the context of operation and finally to start taking control. Phew. Thank you all for your time and for attention. We've covered a lot of ground here, right? From the wild growth of non-human identities to a framework for wrangling them under control. And I encourage you to take these insights back to your teams. Start identifying the NHIs in your environment. Apply the 5 W's. Even small steps like tagging owners, reviewing 1 or 2 high-risk service accounts, those are going to yield immediate improvements. And for those interested in learning more or looking for resources, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to continue this discussion or to help you assess your own environment. Once again, thank you all. I hope you enjoy the rest of Identity Management Day 2025. And together, let's make sure we're in control of our machine identities and keep our organizations secure. Thank you.